go ahead and get started? Perfect. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here today. Here to talk about stuff that on its surface might seem pretty boring, but hopefully you leave this room today very inspired and fired up about banking and finance as climate solutions, which is probably something maybe you were expecting that when you came in today. But just maybe a quick show of hands here. This is my third time at Mountain Towns. If you've seen me talk about this before, maybe just put your hand up so that, okay, awesome. So a lot of new faces will be great. So you might be bored because some of this might be a little repetitive. For everybody else, this will be new. So just to kind of quickly introduce myself, my name is Paul Moinester. I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Topo Finance. To be very candid, I never thought I would ever be a finance person in my entire life. I cut my teeth early in my political career working in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. While I was doing that, I led the congressional opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, and in doing so, sort of developed this expertise leading these big coalitions against major extractive projects. And so after leaving D.C., I spent years working in, up in Alaska and all these places fighting big coal mining projects or fish farms or all these major extractive industries. And little did I know sort of all along the role that finance was playing in any of these things. And so when I found finance very randomly at the Outdoor Retailer Show in 2020, I sort of started learning about some of the stuff I'm going to present to you today. And it just was this incredibly eye-opening, one of those few times in your lives where you have that like aha moment and everything changes in your life. And so we are now sort of pioneering this entire new field of corporate sustainability and financial management, which is, once again, just still, as I say that out loud, weirds me out. But we are working now with companies collectively valued at over $1 trillion across the US and Europe. We've also been really fortunate to work with some of the mountain towns here on some of this work as well. And then just as a sort of slight humble brag, so the research, some of the initial research that we did that I'll be presenting today, Bill McKibben, who will be speaking tonight, has we credited us with uncovering the largest remaining source of huge and hidden carbon emissions in the economy. So this is big emissions, big potential for impact. When we walk through this today, I can talk about this stuff for hours, but that's the last thing that you all probably want. And so I want to make this more of a dialogue. So please feel free to hop in with any questions. And then I'll present towards maybe the first half of this conversation, sort of some of our research, the work that we're doing with companies. But then after that, the real opportunity here is that no matter what town you're coming from or no matter what you're doing, finance is probably one of the major challenges, especially now that you face of frankly, I'm going to, where the fuck, where are we going to get the money? Who is paying for this? And so historically, we have never thought of, there's project finance and all of these innovative things. But I think there's really interesting ways to take the research that we're doing and build innovative financial projects and products and services that will be able to finance the work that you're doing. So I want to spend the second half of our time today honestly doing a little blue sky thinking around that, getting an understanding of what you're doing. We work as a weird way as a nonprofit. We do a lot of research, and that's sort of the foundation of this work. But we really sort of view ourselves as this think and do tank, where we work to not just take the sort of research, but build awareness and to sort of build this out. And so I jokingly say that we're not just building the plane and flying at the same time. We're also popularizing air travel and building air traffic control systems and runways and airports and all of these things, which is a lot. And frankly, we are so far out over our skis in half of it. But with partners like you, I'm sure we'll figure a lot of it out. So so this is something that we don't talk about at all, which is that when we talk about innovation and what we need to be solving climate change, we think a lot about technology. We think about big, shiny things that you get to build, or electric cars that can, are faster than Ferraris off the starting line, these sexy, exciting things. But we don't ever think about finance and the sort of plumbing for how do you actually move money into these solutions at scale. And so it's not big, it's not sexy, and like I say, it's kind of boring as hell until you realize that finance is this opportunity to unlock capital that we can then use to drive into climate solutions and decarbonization of our economy and advancing equity and all of these things in a totally unprecedented level that we're doing right now. And so that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. But we're going to go through a bit of a weird kind of journey, and it seems a little bit circuitous, but it starts because we have to figure out how to make people care. So just, I don't know, raise your hand, and no worries, no shame here at all. Like, do you think of your banking and investing as like part of your climate toolkit for yourself personally? Or awesome, well, you guys are here. That's a very biased crowd, but like fantastic. You guys are crushing it, great. But historically, and I'll use myself as an example of this. So in 2015, I moved to Seattle, and I was sort of starting off my life over again. So I had to get everything I needed, right? Like I rented an apartment, and I was trying to be was much better than I am, frankly, now about being like a good climate consumer. But I like made sure I got an apartment in a LEED certified building that was close to transit, where I could, take public transit, or I could walk places. I, got my used furniture and my, 7th generation soaps and my organic cotton sheets and all of the things that I was supposed to do. And then I literally walked down the street because I needed a new bank, and I opened an account with Chase. And I didn't think at all about it. But it turns out, and as the data I'll show today shows you, that like that decision was by far and away the most important climate decision that I made. And I didn't even think about it as a climate decision at that time. And what's crazy, just start with a little bit of a trivia question for you here. So if you buy a new car in this country, what is the average length that you think that the person will own that car? Any guesses? 8 years, so a little longer. If you buy a new home, or a new home to you, how many years do you think you will own that home? 13 years on average in the US. If you open a bank account at a big Wall Street bank, or actually any sort of bank as your sort of primary bank account, what is the average length that you have that bank account? Yeah, 17 years, right? And so it's nuts that we make these decisions and we don't think about them, and then these incredibly sticky things. And so what we'll sort of talk through today is like that is not unique to you and me as individual consumers. It is absolutely sort of widespread from the biggest companies in the world down to towns, universities, et cetera. Even those that have committed to divestment historically have not thought about their banking as part of it. And so we tend to sort of think that, and we'll sort of walk through all of this, but that when you do this, like it doesn't have a climate footprint. But as the research will show you today is it might be the most impactful thing that you're doing. And so how is that possible? And so this is very simple, but it's kind of the foundation for all of this. And so we'll sort of start with the deposit side because that's the easiest piece of it. So you make money, you go and you put it in a bank. That money doesn't sit there in a vault. Banks take that money and they lend it out across the economy. And that money gets lent out to everything. It gets lent out to home mortgages, commercial lending, commercial real estate. A lot of it also flows to the energy sector. And so we are sort of facing this crossroads where historically most of that money has gone to things like oil industry, mining, et cetera. But we have opportunities to flow that capital towards climate solutions. But we never have thought about it. And what's weird, and we certainly don't think about it this way, which is when you put money in your bank and that bank is lending it out, they are actually borrowing your money to do that. Like it is your money that you have then given them agency to lend out however you see fit. But if you think about it through the lens of like, well, if I were lending money to a friend, would I want that friend to then take that money and lend it to the oil and gas industry? My guess based on the audience here is the answer is probably no to that question. And so it's this weird thing that we've sort of passively let our banks and our financial managers do that for us. And so every dollar as it moves through the financial system generates a carbon footprint. It doesn't matter if it's through a cash deposit or a treasury bond or a money market fund. Money is flowing into the real economy. And in doing so, it generates a carbon footprint. And so what's crazy, and this is something that, when we went and started talking to companies, and I'll get into sort of all the corporate work that we're doing, a lot of companies, like people would tell us like, companies know this, like Apple's just playing dumb with you. But like in reality, nobody knows this, and you will talk to people regularly, and if you ask them, like, if I say, well, your banking generates all these emissions, that's what, well, it's like all the data centers and electronic transfers and all of that stuff. Turns out that when banks lend your money out, it generates 700 times more emissions than everything else banks do combined. So this was research that was done by CDP, sort of looking at the largest banks in the world. And so how those emissions are being generated is in part because when a bank lends out your cash, 20 to 30% of it is flowing to the world's most carbon intensive sectors. And so that's not just oil and gas or energy, it's also utilities, mining, industrial manufacturing, all of this stuff. Any questions as we move through this stuff? Either I've bored you or I'm making complete sense. I'm going to anchor on the latter. And so when you start scaling this out globally and you say, okay, well, we need to be financing the energy transition. What role do banks play in all of this? By 2030, I think these are Bloomberg numbers, get you to this idea that you need to be spending about 4 to 1. So for every dollar lent out, $4 needs to be green for every dollar in dirty. But when you look at the world's biggest banks right now, as of 2023, it was at 89 cents green to every dollar in dirty. So we are way behind the curve in terms of what that lending looks like. And so this is research that we did at Topo Finance, but we actually so banks do not do a great job of disclosing what the emissions are that they generate. So we went and did the math for them and basically found that for the largest 10 banks in the country and the 12 largest asset managers in the country, if you treated them like a nation, they would be the third largest emitting nation in the world, just behind the United States. And so we are talking about, when you look at it at this very big, broad scale, this absolutely massive source of emissions. And we have a partner organization in Europe that did a similar study on the UK banks and found that like the high street banks, which is sort of their equivalent of Wall Street banks, the emissions from them, I think it was like 1.4 times all of the UK's emissions. Yes?
Can you explain that? Like, are you assuming that just because someone gets a loan that you're taking out like the emissions of those companies, all of their emissions?
It's not all of their emissions, so it's literally just for the lending itself. And so the methodology for this gets wonky kind of fast, but it's a great question. And so what we essentially do is you go and you look at how much, and it's sort of it's based on essentially like those. Well, when we do this, we have to look at a higher level. When the companies do this, they're able to look more granularly. But they say, Chase lends to a project. They will then look at the emissions around that lending itself to the project. So what we do is basically, because we don't have the ability to look inside the banks and see what specifically they're lending to, we just know what sectors they're lending to and what geographies. And so we know that if you've lent $1 billion to the energy industry in Eastern Europe, there's like an emissions factor for that, and that's what we use as sort of a proxy data point. And so it's a very clear point that these are sort of like estimates on estimates on estimates, and so we're really careful about not providing too much of a false sense of precision around any of this. But to some degree, as we will sort of show with these companies, like we were talking to a company and they're like, well, are we sure these numbers are right? I'm like, they might not be right, but we're talking that this is like 600% of your emissions. And so like, I don't know, how wrong do they have to be to the point where you don't care about it? Like 90%? I don't know. So these are absolutely sort of, this is part of the challenge, and this is the challenge that we have in this space, is that the data quality is really bad. And that's in part because nobody's ever asked for the data. So I'll tell this quick story, which is that we work with this wonderful company in the Bay Area. We have to sign a lot of NDAs, so I have to speak in some abstract terms when it talks to companies. But they're a great company, big tech company, and we do all this work. We advise companies for free, but they said, hey, we might have some money at the end of the quarter. We would love, if there's money left over in our budget, to give it to you all. So we said, great. And they said, well, will you please just go through our vendor approval process so that if the money is there, you're already pre-approved and we don't have to do that. And so as we're going through this process, they're asking me all of these questions about like, what are our scope 1 and 2, 3 emissions? Like, what are our net zero transition goals? All of this stuff. And what was ironic about it is that we were helping this company who has billions of dollars in cash like ask these questions of their banks, which they never asked before. And so they're asking me, this tiny nonprofit who literally like has, under $1 million a year in operating budget, this stuff. But they've never asked their banks that collectively, hold trillions of dollars in cash and are generating more emissions than like many nations, these questions before. And so there's this like very weird irony that exists there, that it's become the standard practice. But I say that to all this to say that we've never asked, so the data quality is bad because we've never required folks to provide better data around this. And so once again, just sort of looking at a few big macro numbers, and we'll get into much more sort of specific things, but just to sort of landscape this. And so in the 9 years after the Paris Agreement was signed, the 65 largest banks, this was research done by RAND, has lent more than $7.9 trillion to the fossil fuel industry. And that globally, if you look at across the group of 20 nations, the financial institutions, so this is not just banks, this is also asset managers and insurance companies, have over $22 trillion in exposure to the world's most carbon intensive industries. And that 700x stat you already heard. But like that, these emissions are just absolutely massive that comes from this. And so I want to just make this one point before we sort of move into this next phase of this, which is when we think about this, a lot of this work in the past has been framed around divestment. And it's been really thought through the lens of how do we get the biggest banks to stop funding fossil fuels. That is very important, but we need to be thinking more holistically around the roles that banks play in this. And so it's not just how do we ramp down emissions in ramp down lending to fossil fuel companies. It's also how do we ramp up investments in climate solutions, and then very importantly, how do we decarbonize everything else? There are a lot of industries in this country, cement, aluminum, commercial real estate, housing, all of these things that need to be decarbonized. And we need to be thinking holistically about that, because I spend a lot of my time looking at at company reporting around their financials through their 10Ks. It's not very glamorous. I don't recommend anybody do it. But one of the things, if you start spending time looking at that, you essentially see that their financial reporting for a diversified company in terms of what their assets are in is basically a blueprint for how do you decarbonize the economy. Because it's not just money that's being lent out through deposits. It's also mortgage-backed securities, municipal bonds, commercial corporate debt securities, et cetera. And so there's all of these opportunities to be decarbonizing things across these different asset classes. And so it really extends beyond just this initial lending piece. Does that make sense, hopefully? All right, cool. Yes?
Can you help me understand 401k and the ESG filters?
Yeah.
And what that's doing or not doing, and then just the average daily deposits that aren't part of that?
Yeah.
Kind of scope it for me.
Yeah, great. So for the most part, ESG has been applied more to like the equities space. So this is more around stocks and owning percentage of companies. When it comes to climate stuff, the argument that I would personally make, and not necessarily everybody would agree with me on this, is that where the real impact and opportunity for driving capital into the real economy in ways that's going to change things is actually not through equities, and it's not through ESG. That's more of a screening around, and for those who don't know what ESG is, it's environmental, social, and governance. And so it's also this sort of weird bucket that takes these three things together. So for example, and now there's been all of this anti-ESG backlash, and so they're like forbidding people from looking at governance, which is like, let's leave whatever, your woke environmental, social stuff behind. Like being able to look at a company and just being like, they're poorly governed is kind of important from an investment strategy standpoint. And so it was this thing that kind of became this chimera that should never, frankly, existed in the first place. And then it became this gold rush during the sort of boom times of climate. But there's a lot of interesting things, and we can kind of get into some of this if we really want to nerd out around it. But essentially, there's this notion that what happens is like you own a percentage of a company, so you are a shareholder. But a lot of the work, frankly, that the major asset managers have been doing is essentially like divesting their own power in that, because they sort of got stuck in this middle ground where the argument that they were making was like, don't divest, use this lens of ESG, work with us on this, and then we as BlackRock or we as Vanguard will leverage our power to sort of move these companies. Then when the backlash came, they basically said, oh, this is a terrible idea. Everybody hates us because either we're not going far enough or we're going too far. And as Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock, will tell you, like, when you're pissing off everybody, you know you're doing something right, which is like, I mean, I guess. But so basically, we don't look that much at 401ks. We don't work that much on retirement plans. What we really work with is sort of the core assets of your corporate treasury or your municipal treasury around like your some of it is equities, but most of it is going to be like what we call cash equivalent. So cash in banks, money market funds, highly liquid things that are sort of short-term duration cash-like instruments, or these longer-term fixed income products like your treasury bonds or your municipal bonds and all of that. Does that answer your question? Hopefully it makes sense. But it is important to say that like a lot of the initial energy around, and this is why I say this is about far more than divestment, was I'm a university, I don't want to be invested in oil and gas, so I'm going to sell those shares of that stock. And you can argue about the impact of that, but essentially, like, if everybody did it, it would depreciate the value of that. That impact hasn't necessarily borne out. And so we sort of think of this as moving beyond divestment to be thinking about decarbonization of how do I have a financial portfolio that's being used to drive the decarbonization of the global economy, and that's being used to advance sort of equity and social justice, rather than being something where I've like now gotten just the oil and gas out, but still generating a ton of emissions through everything else. So as we sort of go back through all of those numbers, a lot of that research existed before we started this work. And so what we sort of set out to say was like, I mean, it's great to know that my bank lent $65 billion and that this bank only lent $57 billion. But what does that mean for me as a customer, whether I'm an everyday individual or me as a company? Like, what does this actually mean? And so because I'm very cool and very fun, during the pandemic, my like big thing that I did, aside from, all the normal pandemic things, I did not do sourdough. I instead looked at sustainability reports for companies. And what I was sort of curious about, and as Bill McKibben will be here sort of later, and so it's a little odd for me to like sort of say these things, but I always, like, my joke thing that I say is like, well, it's great if Bill McKibben is telling me, Paul, that where I bank matters, but I like am poor and run a small nonprofit and I have a few $1,000s in my bank account. What does it mean for Apple or Google or Microsoft, who has over $100 billion in their bank accounts? And like, I'm not going to be able to move these banks, but they might be able to. And so we sort of developed this weird kind of backwards hook, which was, at the time, all of these companies were really working to ramp up their climate commitments and their sustainability commitments and their net zero goals and all of that. And so the idea we had was, well, what if we could measure these emissions that stem from their banking and investing and then tie it back to their net zero goals and show that maybe we're like, maybe this is 5 or 10% of their emissions, and then now creates a hook for them to like actually care about this. And if we can tie it in, then maybe there's a good forcing function. And so we sort of set out on this 3-path project to, one, essentially what tantamount to essentially we built a novel methodology for tracking the carbon footprint of money as it moves through the financial system and tying it back to the customer. And then the question was, do companies know about this? Do they care about this? And then how do we make them care? Are there ways that we can get this sort of implemented within, the greenhouse gas protocol under scope 3, et cetera? And so that was where we sort of went. And what we found, frankly, shocked us. I remember, I'll never sort of forget one of those conversations that you have that you just look back on. But when I was talking to my research partner on this, who now works for us, but he's a very charming British man, and James Picaro, and I was talking to him, and I was sitting at my table just being like, well, what are we talking about here, James? Are we talking about 3%, 5%, 10%? And he did a quick back of the envelope math on it and figured out that it was around 50% for Apple when we were looking at it. Turns out it was much closer to 130%. And so what we found is, and we sort of try not to call it individual companies too much around this, but if you look at these companies, so everybody from like Airbnb to Amazon to Visa to, pretty good mix of major US companies, that if you were to measure their emissions that stem from their banking and investing and compare it back to their normal scope 1, 2, 3 emissions reporting, that on average these emissions are 76% of their emissions. And so, but for many of these companies like Google and Meta and Netflix, Microsoft, many of them, their banking and investing actually generates more emissions than everything else they do combined, scope 1, 2, and 3. And then when we started talking to these companies, we very quickly learned that they had no clue what we were talking about. And so additional research that we did was just to sort of be like, well, what are we talking about here as a macro issue? And so if you look across the United States, there's over $7 trillion in corporate cash, and the cumulative emissions of that represents about 20% of all emissions in the United States, if you were to measure it. So a lot of emissions, a lot of money, a lot of opportunity for impact. And so we also, and not to pick on Aspen, but Aspen does very good reporting on their emissions and their banking. And so I think this is like 2 years old, but we went and we sort of said, well, what is this? How does this apply to a municipality or a mountain town? And so when we looked at Aspen, we found that their emissions uplift, so this is how much money they had in cash and investments. This is the emissions they were reporting, 179,000. And then when we calculated their banking emissions, it was around 49,000, which represents about 27% of emissions. So big source of emissions for a mountain town like Aspen. And then we sort of said, all right, we know we could take all this data and scale it down for individuals. And so we then did a project where we essentially looked at, well, if we were to compare this to other sort of individual consumer activities, how does it shake up? And I should note that this is based on our old research. I haven't actually updated this. This number is now closer to 4, which would make something like that closer to 10. So even larger than we initially thought. But that if you have money in a Wall Street bank, the emissions that stem from that, just even $10,000 is larger than the average residential energy use in the US, average diet, flying, et cetera. So you say, all right, great, well, it's helpful to know that I'm accidentally doing a lot of negative stuff with my banking. What do the solutions look like? And so if you were then to take it and move your money, and it'll be very clear when it comes to a lot of the work we do with companies and towns, it's not so much about moving money. Individuals, it makes it a little bit easier. But if you were to say, what does this look like for me personally, and you were to move your money to a green bank, so some of these are well-known green banks like Amalgamated Bank or Climate First Bank that have a green mission, but even like your local credit union, I've never looked at Alpine Bank, but I would imagine somewhat in line here, which is to say moving $10,000 from a green bank is like larger than adopting a vegan diet. It only takes moving like $13,000 or $14,000 to have the same indicative emissions reduction as switching to an EV. And what's neat about this is that a lot of green banks actually are pretty good when it comes to the interest rates they provide. So you can actually make more money doing this. So the highest interest rate actually offered in the country right now is by a bank called Climate First Bank in Florida. So you can actually make more money and reduce your emissions, as opposed to a lot of these things that have whether it's a personal life thing of like, adopting a vegan diet takes some change in your normal day-to-day behavior, and if you love meat, then you feel like you're giving something up. Switching to an EV can be great, but also like comes with costs and other hassle. And so this is something that's a very high impact, low risk, and oftentimes a value generating. Yeah.
So when you say that this calculation is part of scope 3 emissions, that those rules aren't on there?
Yes. So that's a great question. And so when we set out, I sort of said there were these three questions, which was like, could you calculate the emissions? Are companies caring about this? Where does this fit in? So in 2021, we went and met with we met with WRI, who runs the greenhouse gas protocol. And basically what they told us is, we've always thought this was part of scope 3, category 15. We've just never had the data or methodology to require companies to report it. So since then, we've been working with them kind of quietly behind the scenes to sort of be like, great, can we now get this in there? Unfortunately, the challenge is, for those who are paying attention to this sort of world, is like that has turned into an absolute cluster, because like all of the SBTI and all of these entities are now that the rubber's hitting the road for folks having to do stuff. There's a lot of pushback. There's sort of a lot of politicization of all of this. The last time we talked to the folks at WRI about this, it felt like they were being monitored by lawyers in the conversation, as opposed to like the very freewheeling conversation we had had with them 4 years before. And so our hope is that we can still move it into that world, but we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. But what we do know, and we work really closely with like the B Lab community, is that this is now starting to get factored into like B Lab scores and things like that. And so there's other mechanisms to get this into these sort of institutionalized reporting frameworks that exist beyond scope 1, 2, and 3. And here, so we sort of took this data that we had and we actually built a calculator with the help of our friends Compose Creative. And so if you use that QR code right now, it'll take you to our website. If you don't want to use a QR code, you can just go to topofinance.org/calculator. And what you'll find there is essentially a quick way that you can, this is very high level, but just sort of show, like, if I have $20,000 in the bank or $5,000 in the bank, big Wall Street bank, and if you were to move it to a regional bank, a green bank, like what would the emissions reduction look like be, and then how does it compare to these other consumer behaviors? I will apologize in advance. There's over 4,000 banks in this country, so we only looked at a very small number of them. So if you have questions, if your bank's not on there, let me know. Happy to help just sort of do a little desk research and help you kind of get better data on that. Yes.
How do credit cards factor into this? Say, like, I have a bill and I'm using Chase, right, for that bank account, but I'm paying with a green bank.
Yeah.
But I've got, say, I'm taking out X amount on the Chase credit card every month. How does that factor into this?
Yeah, so credit card, it's a great question. So credit cards sort of fit into this other, there's basically these two buckets that we look at, which is like, what is direct emissions impact, where like money is then flowing out into sort of this world, and then what are these other things that are fees-based things that help banks make more money. And so credit cards sort of fall into that second bucket of, we can't show you the emissions of using a Chase credit card, we can show you what it looks like for the lending. It kind of then becomes something more like, if you're buying a book, would you rather buy it from your local bookstore down the road, or would you rather buy it from Amazon type of thing? And so that's where it's more of it's sort of the same product. It's just a matter of who's making the money off it, but there's not a direct kind of emissions correlation that we're able to make. Does that make sense? Awesome. Any other questions? All right, great. So now we're going to get to the point where you've now suffered through all of the data and we get to talk about the fun stuff. So our vision at Topo is we want to create a world in which all companies, cities, organizations, and people harness their finances as their sort of great climate superpower. And so where we get really excited is to say, well, what does this look like for your mountain town? We can work with you, and we've been working with some towns to help them figure out, like, how do we actually do the work that we're doing with companies, where we look at our banking and investing, and we measure emissions, and we engage with our bank, and we do all of that. But where I think this stuff gets really exciting is this can go much farther than decarbonization. It's about rethinking how we build and scale new financial products. And so I don't know if anybody here are using muni bonds, but like the muni bond space is really, once again, I say this like I'm a fucking dork, but like it's fascinating because nobody cares about it in a lot of ways. Like my buddy who I do a lot of this work with, who's an old friend of mine from college, I jokingly say, but it was true. Like he was the guy I always made sure to study with in college because I did much better in classes when I worked with him. And he's this brilliant dude, and we were working on some stuff around muni bonds. And the thing that he does is like when he wants to learn about something, he just goes and he reads a lot. And so PhD from Harvard, and so he was like, well, what books can I buy? And he went out to look at, went and typed into like muni bond books. The most recent book was a reprint. It was in 2013. That was a reprint of a book from like 2002, I think it was. So like this is a very underappreciated, very unsexy space. But when I look at the opportunities that we have, we're working with companies that collectively hold billions and billions of dollars in municipal debt or other types of government debt that want greener variations of it. They don't really exist at scale, and the ones that do exist, frankly, are often sort of subpar from an impact standpoint there. And so when I sit here in rooms at mountain towns and I hear, like, we want to deploy this solar project or we want to do this fleet conversion, the question always comes back to, like, who's going to pay for it and where does the money come from? And people don't love raising taxes, and so especially in wealthy places. And so we see a world in which there's opportunities to do really innovative things, particularly around muni bonds, but other types of financing mechanisms to be working with mountain towns like you all. We do not have any answers, and so this is both now a little bit of an invitation, but also just sort of a point for conversation around, like, we would love to know more about how we can help you all. So we exist, as I said, in sort of this weird world where we just kind of like to dig in and solve problems and help do things. And so we've been working, like I said, with a few towns to help them think through what this looks like from this decarbonizing cash standpoint. But where I think this becomes really compelling is how do we work together to use innovative financial products that look and feel and smell exactly like a normal muni bond or a normal corporate debt security or whatever it is, but now they're going to decarbonizing your towns and helping achieve the outcomes that you all are hoping to achieve. And so if you don't want to talk about that, we can wrap and you can now go play outside for 30 minutes. But hopefully would love to just sort of open up the floor to questions about any of this, but also sort of conversations now that you've heard this around how can we be working either collectively with us or without us, but with each other as towns to figure out how do we use innovation from the financial side to drive decarbonization and achieve all the goals that you try to have. So thank you for your time and attention. Would love to chat about that if you all are open to it. Yes.
This is a very intro question.
Yeah. No intro questions. They're all good questions.
As a sustainability staff person,
Yeah.
I want to talk to the finance department about this. I work for a local government.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is not an intro question. This is great. So part of what's really interesting and challenging about this work is that you're working with essentially two different kind of communities, right? You have the sustainability community inside of whether it's company or a town, whatever, it's the same thing. And then you have the treasury teams. These people have very different mindsets. Oftentimes people who are sustainability people are like excited about the disruption of how do we do big, bold things? How do we make stuff happen? I want to change the world. And treasury people are by nature, and I don't mean this politically, but just through their thought are the most conservative people that you'll find in any entity, because their entire thing is about managing risk. And like the last thing that they want to do is rock the boat. So a lot of the work that we do with companies and towns is actually helping start that conversation. And it's about sort of training the sustainability teams around how to go talk to their treasurers, because I can guarantee you if you hear this presentation today and you're excited about it, and then you get back to your town on Thursday and you send your treasurer or your financial officer a note being like, hey, I saw this great thing. Turns out our bank, we got to change all of our banks. We got to get all our money out of fossil fuels. They will either not respond or they will send you a not particularly nice response. And so a lot of the work that we do is sort of that, like, how do we go talk about this? And so part of it is really understanding the mindset of those people and recognizing that, one, oftentimes, especially in companies, these treasurers will have decades-long relationships with these banks. They are their friends. They are their allies. They look to them when they need help with certain things. And so it's not something where they're like really excited to rock the boat. And so this is where you sort of take a step back and you sort of take that change management hat on and put it on and sort of say, like, hey, so I was at this Mountain Towns thing, and I learned that actually it turns out that how Mountain Towns Bank and Invest has all of these, environmental impacts, but also all this really positive potential upside. Would love to have a conversation with you just to understand what this all looks like. Just to be clear, not trying to tell you to change anything, but just like really want to understand, because we're applying this climate lens to all of these different aspects of how our town works, but we haven't done that to our banking. So we'd love to like take you out for coffee and just chat with you about that. We actually have a draft email that says as much that I'm happy to send you that we have written to make it easier for doing that. And so
I was just going to say, I do know we bank with Alpine as an entity, but I
great.
don't know anything else beyond that.
Yeah. And what town are you with? Sorry if you don't mind me asking. Awesome. Well, if you want, I'm happy to come to your town and help you have this conversation.
We always have that.
Yeah, I know. It's totally right. It turns out. I'm sorry, 1 second. But just to say that, like, it is a really important piece of all of this is to understand the sort of change management aspects of these things. And so even if you're with Alpine, and I know Alpine, like, from a sort of reputational standpoint, I've never actually talked to them. So I can tell you, just knowing how big they are and all of that stuff, that they're not financing some of the worst stuff in the world. They might be banking local fossil fuel companies or things like that. I also don't know this, but I would imagine that they don't have, and this is where this so let me just stop by saying that there's a lot of times organizations and startups and all of this sort of have this mindset of very Field of Dreams-ish of like, if you build it, they will come. Like, we just need to build a good product. I have this idea for doing a ski rental company, and then people will come and start using this. Even if nobody ever asked you, Bryn, to create that, I don't know the history of it. But when it comes to banks, it is a very much don't ask, don't get standpoint. If you are not asking your bank for something, they are not going to build it for you. And so even for something like Alpine Bank, there are opportunities for them to build like a green cash product, for example, which is something to ensure that your money is being deployed in Colorado, for example, to advance solar or wind or other types of renewable energies. Those products exist inside banks. And if you ask them for that, they might create that. And if a lot of towns are asking them for that, they might create that. And that might now create this demand for them to go out and figure out, okay, we need to be financing more green projects in the state because all these people are asking us to fund this stuff. And so, you would be able to sort of build out a product like that. And so there's a lot of opportunities even for banks that are leading on this for them to develop specialized products for you. And so happy to work with you to, even if I don't get to come to Telluride, to help you figure all that out. But yeah, that's where this sort of important component of that customer relationship standpoint is. And what people in banks will also tell you, we have the former CFO of Sustainable Finance from HSBC on our team, and what she always said was our mantra in our bank was if you're not talking to the customers, you're losing, because you don't know what they want. And so there's this aspect of this conversation where if you wanted to go and talk to Alpine Bank and you suggested that to your financial officer, it's not necessarily an adversarial thing to say, like, why are you not reporting this, or why haven't you joined this? It's like, hey, we know you're great. Like, what are you doing? Do you want to do more stuff like this? We would love to see X. And it can become a very positive interaction and much less of a sort of contrarian interaction. Even if you're with Wells Fargo, for example, who we have rated as the lowest bank in the world as far as like the biggest banks. So sorry if you bank with Wells Fargo. Yeah, sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about green banks in particular. I mean, like, how does one, what is the criteria? Is it just, I mean, how much can one even know? And isn't there also like a cost to it? I mean, are they insured? Like, are
Yeah.
deposits safe? I assume, but like, also if they lend, is it at a higher rate because it's a little bit more boutique-y, possibly?
Yeah.
Because I always feel like the buck stops as soon as real money is spent.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like, okay, this all sounds good, but if it's going to cost,
Yeah.
then I'm okay.
I'm out.
Like,
Yeah.
Tobacco, drilling, whatever. Like, I don't care. Don't tell me about it.
Yeah, so it's a great question and point. And I think that one of the things that now I'm regretting not putting this in there, but so one of the people that we work with who's the most outspoken on this, not surprisingly, is the treasurer from Patagonia, a guy named Charlie Bischoff. And so I will give them very much their kudos in saying that when we went and started talking to companies about this, none of them had any idea what we were talking about. But I had already learned a lot from Charlie at Patagonia and what they had been doing, because they were way ahead of the curve on all of these things. And so Charlie has sort of done more, and granted it's Patagonia, but he's still a corporate treasurer who has to like do things in a fiduciary responsible way. And what he will tell you is that he has been able to apply an impact lens to his banking and investing while reducing the fees that they incur and also increasing their return. And so there's a lot of, it's not necessarily a trade-off. It can very much be a trade-up in these things. And a lot of the work that we do with companies is we recognize all of these impulses to not change things. And so we're constantly not just trying to sell this as like a moral argument. It's actually much more of a business argument around why they should be doing these things. And so to the specific question around green banks themselves. And so there's over 4,000 banks in this country. There are a very small percentage of them, probably around 20 to 30 banks, that you would say like are doing a lot to fund the fossil fuel industry, and I would say are like, you know, and this is not even a value judgment around them. They are banking the economy, and banking the economy means banking oil and gas. And in doing so, they have a pretty substantial carbon footprint, and many of them are not necessarily leaders in reporting data or having any types of sort of policies around green lending or anything like that. And so, and then there's about a lot of thousands of banks that are kind of just, their model is that they work in commercial real estate or commercial, you know, or home mortgages is primarily what they're doing. And so their footprint is much lower. They may not necessarily be like what I would call a green bank, but they're substantially better from an emissions standpoint because their business model is around lending to things that are like actively less bad, but that's just not intentional. That's just their business model. And so, and then there's a much smaller then group of banks sort of that would be your like community banks and CDFIs and credit unions that have more of a social mission aligned with them. They also have much lower emissions because their business model is to like lend to things inside the community, lend to stuff that has a social impact around them. And then there's the sort of the smallest group, which is the what I would call like quote unquote green banks that are set up to have a climate impact and a climate lens to them. And so the major ones are Climate First Bank, as the name might imply, Amalgamated Bank out of New York, Beneficial State Bank out of California, Sunrise Bank in Minnesota is a good one. They belong to a partnership called the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. Some of them are also B Corps, like Spring Bank in New York, is that they're starting to do more climate stuff, but they're also historically like very much tied to funding things in the Bronx. And so that's sort of the lens of that. And so they are all FDIC insured. So as long as you have under $250,000, like all of your money is protected. I will be very honest in saying that the trade-off that you will get is that if you go bank with a bank that's smaller, like you're just not maybe getting the same level of service and sophistication that you would get from a Chase or a Wells Fargo, because they can spend billions and billions of dollars on improving their interfaces and their customer services, and they can give you free wiring and all of these things. And so like there is a service challenge around that. Where we start getting excited is we were working on rolling out a product and we had a bit of a snafu. But essentially, there are these innovative ways that you can use fintech to solve a lot of this stuff. And so we were actually working on a product that allowed you to keep your money inside your existing bank, like in terms of that's where your business is, but then you could sweep excess cash out into banks like Climate First Bank and into others, and it reduces your emissions by about 90% and actually increases the return that you get. And so like that's what the future of this frankly looks like, I think is more on the financial services side of all of this and using fintech and modern products to help solve a lot of these challenges. Rather than necessarily saying like you need to now go move from Capital One to your local credit union. It's great if you want to do that, but just to be very candid about it, like you will most likely, I mean, in some ways you might get better service in that you know your local banker and you can go and talk to them and you have a good relationship with them, but you're not going to get the same, bells and whistles that you'll get working with Chase.
Are those green banks that you just named, are they available to provide municipal bonds? Like, as an elected official, I don't really touch our municipal bonds except for just to approve or not approve them, but not necessarily for green work for the municipality, but let's say we just have to build a sewer intersection.
Yep. Yeah, no, a lot of them do that work as well. And so that's a great question. And so there's a bank that we work with up in Maine called Androscoggin Bank. They're a 150-year-old bank. They're doing a lot of really progressive things now in terms of environmental impact, but their major source of business is munis. So they work a lot with munis in Maine. And so happy to talk to you offline to help you maybe find some banks locally. But that's like part of this sort of it's a really important piece of this too, is like where does the lending and underwriting come from to do this? And in theory, just sort of a little bit like what we were talking about with credit cards is, and you'd rather that money go to folks that are investing that back in your local community and advancing the things that you're trying to advance as a town, rather than sort of, taking that money and then moving it offshore and investing in oil and gas in Africa or something like that. So, yeah. You decide, I don't want to choose. Yeah.
The national bank, is that the same with the green bank?
Yeah, it's often the case. So it's really, and this is part of the trade up and now the trade off piece. And so big banks take deposits for granted. In a lot of cases, they end up being a bit of a burden. And so if you have your money in a Chase or Wells Fargo, you might just be getting like, your interest rate might be like 0.5%. The highest interest rate right now in the country is from Climate First Bank, and it's at 4.56. And so a lot of these greener banks are trying to grow, and so they are raising their interest rates in order to acquire more customers. And so it is a really nice piece of this, which is, and this product that we are working on, that's part of how we can deliver more money, is because you're putting money into banks that are looking to grow, that are hungry for deposits, and they're willing to pay for them. And so a lot of community banks and credit unions will offer much higher interest rates than big national banks for that very reason. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. And I would say when it comes to the big companies we work with, like the company that I mentioned earlier that we work with, they have more money in cash and investments than every one of those green banks do. So they're not really viable banking partners for them. They might be able to do a little bit. A lot of them are starting to move their like foundation money and philanthropic money into some of these greener banks. But when it comes to, and it gets crazy. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. Like, we work with a major European company that has over 4,000 bank accounts, which just is like boggles the mind. His job seems horrible, but so like for them, they're working with the world's biggest banks, and they're working with banks in Brazil, they're working with banks in China, all these different places that they're operating. And so when it comes to you or I, it's very easy for me to say, well, I can move my money from Wall Street Bank into Climate First Bank and still get 90% of my services met. When it comes to these big companies that we work with, that's not really an option for them. And so this is where the sort of theory of change switches to more of a like stay and engage standpoint around these things, and sort of use your customer power that you have to demand better. And so, but within that, there is splitting and shifting. And so we've developed this sort of model that we call split and shift, which to be very candid, is more theoretical than a practice right now because we're just starting to get companies to start using it. But the idea is if you're working with, let's just say you get money market funds from like 8 different banks, which a lot of these companies will do. Well, how do you then take those 8 banks? And we've now developed, sorry, I don't have a QR code for this one, but on our website, if you go to topofinance.org/bank evaluation, we developed a bank evaluation system because part of the challenge is how good is my bank? How bad is my bank? It's pretty subjective, and like if you look at one metric, if you look at another. So we attempted to sort of solve this problem to help improve the choice architecture around this. And so we set out and we analyzed 28 global banks. So these are big Wall Street banks in the US and big European banks that are sort of the core audience of banks that big companies will use as their banking partners. And so we went out and we looked at them and we analyzed them across 15 different sort of categories, and then we now have a ranking system where we rank them 1, BNP Paribas, 28, Wells Fargo. And it's important to note that within that there's a lot of subjectivity and there's a lot of different things that you can sort of pull apart and put back together in different ways. And so, but what we sort of say is like, okay, we've broken this down into these 3 different buckets and to be very clear, like BNP is doing a lot better than Wells Fargo or Chase, but they're by no means where they need to be, right? And so this is sort of the, ranking them amongst peers rather than ranking them against like the leading banks in the world. As far as what sort of their climate performance looks like. But if you're now a corporate treasurer and you say, okay, we have money market funds from these 8 different banks, 2 of our banks are red, 3 of our banks are yellow, and 3 of our banks are green, right, in the sort of hierarchy of these things. All right, well, can we maybe take some of this away from the ones in the red and move that up to the yellow, or move some of the yellow up to the green, and reward the people who are doing better with more business and punish the ones with less? And so it's more about sort of shifting and moving things around within your current parameters. Or maybe you say, great, well, we didn't realize that P&P was so great. We're getting our money market funds from them. Turns out we can also use them for FX trading, which is not a direct impact thing, but it's a fee thing. So let's now move more of our FX trading to them as well. And so it sort of is more about splitting and shifting things around within your framework rather than it is saying because to be honest, if you're a big US company and you need a bank with US banks, you can choose the best of bad options, but that's about as good as you're going to get. And so, and there's not that big of a difference between the ones that rank in the best and the ones that rank in the worst. And so it really becomes about honestly leveraging Europe and elsewhere, which many of these US companies will also bank with as well. So, but it's part of the big challenge is there's not good switching options right now.
Yeah, 2 questions. One, with regards to some of these big banks, it seems like you're also talking about advocacy for large companies that are investing in them to ask them to also put those investments into decarbonization,
Yeah.
into renewables. So can you talk about what that looks like right now? Are some big banks doing that to some extent? And then my second question is if you can talk a little bit about the output, say investment in green banks or where are they putting that money? Where is that going? What are the kind of projects that are getting funded? How can people tap into that?
Yeah, so I'll sort of answer it backwards, but say, and I'll also just note, just so you know, we don't take money from banks, which is a very just important thing so that we are unbiased and all these things. And so we work more closely with some banks, so I might speak about them more positively. And so we work very closely with Climate First Bank as an example. They've developed a fintech product that allows them to deploy solar lending more. And so right now, they're the fastest growing bank in the country. I think they have 1.3 billion in assets under management. But in the last 4 years, they've deployed over $220 million into solar lending. And so that's an example of a bank that has really set out with this mission of let's do this, let's be innovative. And as a result of that, they're the fastest growing bank in the country, actually. And so, and they also provide the really high interest rates, which is helpful why they're growing so fast. But so that's an example of a bank that's really looking at that. Androscoggin Bank in Maine, there's a lot of, and I can't quite remember the whole history of this, but there's a lot of interesting things in sort of within the the Muslim community around bank relationships and bank lending, and they've like worked with a lot of the Islamic community in Maine to figure out like how they can do that. And so they've now actually created like special bank accounts and products and services for that community of people that like sort of ties into some of their more religious traditions and the sort of, and so there's a lot of, I mean, that's like a much smaller example of it, but a way to say that some of these banks are really tied into the local community and trying to figure out whether, how do we sort of support them and their needs, or how do we sort of build products that then can be scaled. And so Climate First Bank is open sourcing their tool, and they want other banks to use it because their goal is to, like, they recognize they're not going to own all of this. They want to achieve that. And so that's what that looks like when a bank is sort of being much more forward thinking and progressive around the how do we ensure that we are like lending as much money to good as possible. Thank you. And so the second part of that, if I remember correctly, is, sorry, can you repeat that part?
Yeah, some of these larger companies
Yeah.
have to invest in these larger banks.
Yeah.
What is their scope of influencing where those investments go in the banks? Like, do you see much shifting happening
Yeah.
within the banks based off of that kind of advocacy?
Yeah, so I would say, to be very candid, like right now we're too early to show real change. It has been a pretty grueling 4-year journey to get from going and talking to these companies and having them think that we were nuts to now getting some of these companies to do this work. And so I would say that the honest answer is like we haven't hit a critical enough scale yet to be able to say like, well, we were able to get, you know, company X to be able to influence bank Y to do Z. Like, we haven't gotten there yet. But what we do know, and this is like from our former CFO, our person who works for us, who's the former CFO of Sustainable Finance for HSBC, is that when they had a green deposit product there and they started advertising it to companies in Europe, that they actually had so much demand for it that they then had to like go out and find more green things to lend to. And so there are some examples of these things. We have not seen it directly with our work yet, but we're bullish that that will happen. And also just to say that part of what's really important in all of this is if you're working with your banks, like there, even in the worst banks, there are like very great people who went inside there to try to change things and move things along. And so a colleague of mine met recently with the head of sustainable investment at Wells Fargo, and he is thrilled about all of this because he's been trying to figure out like, how do I get customers to come talk to me about this and do this stuff? And so now we're going to be chatting with him in the next week or two to sort of leverage the companies that we have and connect the dots together so that now he has the customers to saying like, look, they want green corporate deposits, we could potentially build it. So that's just an example of showing that like we're not there yet, but we're bullish on getting there in the near-ish term. But it's also just to say that even in these banks that they might be the lowest on our scorecard, they might have rolled back all of their net zero commitments over the last 2 years. But at the same time, there's still people who work there that want to do good things. And if you can go to them, you can make really impactful things happen. And considering, you know, the portfolio that this guy manages is probably larger than the entire IRA in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so if you can get him to do more good stuff, you can do more things quietly behind the scenes with banks than you can do publicly through policy. And we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that that's part of the next phase of this work is how do we prove that out? Because there is this demand for all of the sides, and there are these banks that want to be lending things. And so the question can become, how do we align all of these interests and create more favorable rates, make it a win for everybody along the pathway? The sort of like greenium has gone away in the muni bond market from what I know from talking to these folks. But the crazy thing is that the supply side is so low that the demand for these things, they just get snapped up in the market immediately. And so it's the supply side that's really the challenge and not so much the demand side of it all. And so I think the question to your point is very much like, how do we figure out how to align all of the interests together to get this flowing so that the folks that want to be financing the good stuff are now financing you, but they're doing it at a favorable rate to you both, essentially. And so I got to wrap this up. I'm getting the sign from the back of the room, even though I told them I wouldn't listen to them, but I am. But so just to say, I really appreciate your time and attention. As you noted, this is like very much at the beginning of all of these things. And so there are all of these questions, and I I find that part of this work really exciting is that we're in this exploratory phase. Like I would imagine if you're here, you love going into uncharted backcountry and finding your way. And so there's tremendous exciting route finding and all of this. And so just to say, like, we're here as a nonprofit to be your partner in all of this. We don't charge anybody anything for any of this work. And so if you have questions, if you want to learn more about this, if you want help doing any part of this, please reach out to me. You can find me at paul@topofinance.org. You can go to our website. We have more resources around all of this. But we're here to help you solve the problems that you want to solve. And so really appreciate your time and attention and excited about the opportunity to work with you all moving forward, whether it's in Telluride or on a Zoom call. So, all right, thanks so much.